Good evening, Sydney. I'd just like to welcome you all here this evening. My name is James McDonald and I'm a member of the United Australia Party team that have helped host these events for you. Craig Kelly will be your guest MC this evening.
Thank you so much, and what a wonderful crowd we have tonight. As you're all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic response has divided opinion around Australia and the world. But as a former leader of the United Australia Party, Sir Robert Menzies once said, "Today's truth is frequently tomorrow's error. If truth is to be triumphant, the process of free debate must go on." And that is the spirit that we're here in tonight. Now, we know there have been many adverse effects attributed to the COVID-19 vaccines, which until recently have had limited publication. We're here today to assist in the understanding of the COVID vaccines and the side effects of this so-called immunisation. To get the ball rolling, our first speaker tonight is Queensland GP Dr. Melissa McCann. Dr. McCann comes from a pharmaceutical background, is a registered general practitioner and a practice owner. She is an incredible woman with an incredible story, and trust me, she has some extremely important information to share with us all tonight. Dr. McCann started as a pharmacist, working on before commencing postgraduate medical education in Western Australia. Since completing her medical training, she has worked around Australia and has now settled on the Whitsunday coast, where she built a reputation as a caring and highly competent general practitioner. Please give a big welcome to Dr. Melissa McCann.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Craig, for such a generous introduction. I just want to start this final talk tonight by sincerely and humbly thanking Mr. Clive Palmer and the United Australia Party for so generously hosting this important event. It has been an absolutely humbling and so hopeful to have spent a few days with this incredible professional and competent group of people. The other international expert speakers, Dr. Peter McCullough and his beautiful wife, Dr. Pierre Corey and Mr. John Leake, and also Mr. Clive Palmer's amazing team. I actually don't know how this incredible team has managed to pull off this event, but I do know that these people literally should be running this country. They are the most capable, dedicated, caring and professional team of people that I've ever worked with. And we've been so generously accommodated by Mr. Palmer, and I've been struck by the thought that someone with the vast resources and influence that he has, he could much more easily be bunkering down on a luxurious private island with his family and friends, whilst the rest of us face whatever dystopian future the unelected elites have planned for us. And instead, this quite incredible man has cared enough about the fate of his fellow Australians to challenge the COVID narrative and to use his resources to support the vaccine injured and to provide this forum for all of us to share the truth. So from the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, all truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. As I consider this truth self-evident, I will speak as such. I will be discussing severe adverse events and deaths following vaccines, and I apologise for any distress that may cause. So 2020 to 21 to me was defined largely by fear. Media images of coffins, body bags and ICU scenes out of Italy and Wuhan, and stories of healthcare workers dying from COVID. Next, the somewhat threatening statement from AHPRA, the regulator for all health practitioners, on the 9th of March 21, which brought a new type of fear, that any discussion unfavourable to the COVID vaccine program could be career-ending. I think it's true to say that despite all of that, we first look forward to the COVID vaccine, and that for the most part, doctors, nurses and healthcare workers were first in line for ourselves, our parents and grandparents, myself included. But as the program rolled out more broadly in my rural area from around the end of 21, I started to see more adverse events than ever before. For context, my clinic has always given a lot of vaccines and has deliberately encouraged childhood and flu vaccines for many years by offering these to all patients without any fee. For the COVID vaccines, I incidentally did very few due to the arrangements for pharmacies and the government-funded respiratory clinics to do these. And from around the end of 21, none at all. But my patients would still come in after having had their vaccine given elsewhere, and I had never seen anything like this. One young patient with extensive blood clot after vaccination, several patients with strokes, patient after patient with miscarriages, and these at later gestation requiring D&C. Patients with chest pain and unusual debilitating neurological symptoms. In 1 week, 4 patients with confirmed myocarditis. In a region with a population of maybe 15,000, and my patient group just a small fraction of that, the numbers just did not add up. By chance, maybe I would see 1. Multiple cases of myocarditis, this was impossible. So in mid-November of 21, I sat down to do an informal practice audit and look at some of those adverse events and found there was a clear increase compared to previous years. I went onto the TGA Dane database and was horrified to see the reported death in a 14-year-old. Reports of cardiac arrests in teenagers, at least some of those with death as a reported outcome, case after case of severe cardiac events in young people, and literally thousands of severe events, strokes, blood clots, neurological events, blindness, heart attacks. So I immediately wrote to Minister Hunt and John Skerritt describing what I had observed in my patients and highlighting these serious adverse events on the Dane. I requested the immediate suspension of the vaccination program and a review of the safety issues. From John Skerritt, the response that for the fatal outcome of the teenage girl, they did not believe the death was related to vaccination and that there was no safety signal for sudden or unexpected death in young people. He advised that there are around 150 sudden cardiac deaths in young people each year, so it was inevitable that there would be growing numbers of reports of death to the database. And finally, that the TGA's focus remains on keeping Australians as safe as possible from a dangerous and very contagious virus that has killed millions of people globally. Frankly, I would have preferred the TGA's focus remain on the vigilant and competent regulation of therapeutic goods, including adverse event surveillance. And I think I was naive enough then that I was quite put out by this response. To compare, in 2010 in Western Australia, the halting of the childhood flu vaccines after several nurses and doctors had noticed an increase in events such as febrile convulsions compared to previous years. A detailed report later reviewed the timeline, and within weeks the program was suspended. The safety signal was identified based on the reports of just a few doctors and nurses recognising a change to the usual pattern of events and an increase in the proportionality reporting ratio. This ratio is one way of comparing reports to the database from a particular product compared to similar products and takes into account the number of doses given. Normally, a ratio of more than 1 suggests a higher than expected rate of adverse events. In fact, prior to the COVID vaccine rollout in Australia, a ratio of 1 was selected to allow for faster detection of signals, and the ratios were to be reported weekly rather than bi-monthly. Documents recently released on Freedom of Information show this analysis was not done weekly, but continued bi-monthly, and show ratios of not only more than 1, but well over 2 for cardiac arrest for the vaccines across the period. And for other serious events such as intestinal ischemia, pulmonary infarction, ratios of more than 20 and up to 50 during the time of highest uptake, ratios over 20 for myocarditis, again during the peak of the vaccine rollout, rare and serious events such as vertebral artery dissection, aortic dissection and rupture, aneurysms, strokes, intracranial hemorrhages were shockingly high given these are such rare events. Compare again with just 11 years prior, with the reporting ratio just edging over 2 and within 1 month of that signal being detected, the national suspension of the program. In addition, deciding causality versus coincidence does not just involve looking at ratios or background rates. The WHO Handbook for Adverse Event Surveillance provides a simple method and a flowchart. For example, is there a strong temporal relationship? That is, that the event started soon after the vaccine. In this patient, can we confirm another cause for the event? Is there evidence in the published literature that the vaccine may cause such an event? And is there a biological plausibility that the vaccine may cause such an event? And complicating the issues was that even doctors who had themselves had severe adverse events often remained of the belief that they should not discuss their often life-changing events with others and that they should continue to encourage vaccination. And so these doctors and other health professionals suffered in silence, unable to even discuss with their own colleagues for fear of ridicule or reprimand. And it has been near impossible to have any honest, open discussion about the harms the vaccines may cause due to the APRA statement, media censorship, and conflicting advice from official sources. And of course, mandates in this or any environment were and are a catastrophe of medical ethics that deserves a talk all of its own. And I saw patients who had presented months after the vaccine with ongoing chest pain and breathlessness, especially when they exercised, who resorted to paying $1,000 to have an MRI done privately, and finally they would get a diagnosis of myocarditis months and months after vaccination. And I often reflected that had these patients died from a heart attack or a cardiac arrest at any point in the months between the vaccine and finally getting an MRI and the myocarditis diagnosis, that there is no way that their death would have ever been attributed to the vaccine. And with the astonishing excess death rates in Australia and around the world, I wondered just how many people this or something similar might be happening to. And so I would describe waking up for me the way John Green described falling asleep or falling in love, slowly and then all at once. And in 2022, I woke up and all at once. And in March of 22, I wrote to Minister Hunt and John Skerritt, again, this time with 14 other doctors from various specialties co-signing, again requesting in the strongest terms the immediate suspension of the program and a review of the safety issues. I raised again the reports of cardiac events and the risks potentially related to the genetic sequences of the vaccines, including risks due to impacts of microRNA sequences and potential oncomeres, which are small RNA sequences that cause cancer, and for which the TGA acknowledged in a Freedom of Information response that they had not evaluated. I raised the unknown metabolism of the lipid nanoparticle adjuvants, and these metabolic animal studies were stopped after just 4 hours in animals. And at that time, almost none of the lipids had been metabolized from the liver at all. How long these products stay in the body or their metabolic pathway is entirely unknown. And these are highly inflammatory and cross the blood-brain barrier and into the neurotissues, into the spinal cord, into the ovaries and the testes. And of course, genotoxicity and carcinogenicity studies had not been performed, with dubious justification for this oversight, in my opinion, which also deserves another talk all to itself. And finally, I raised the concerns of safety in pregnancy, and with an assessment obtained by Freedom of Information, first suggesting a category B2 for the Pfizer product, noting the abnormalities in the animal reproductive study of supernumerary lumbar ribs in fetuses from Comirnaty-treated female rats, which then, without explanation, was revised to remove this sentence and to change to a category B1 in the publicly available product information. And the preclinical studies also demonstrate a number of other fetal anomalies and a doubling of the risk of miscarriages in these animal studies, and this reflected what I was seeing in my patients. And so, unsatisfied with the responses of coincident adverse events and deaths following vaccination, I undertook a Freedom of Information request process with the TGA. And following an unexpectedly arduous consultation process, I received 10 documents containing the TGA causality assessments. Amongst them, a 21-year-old female who died from myocarditis and cardiac arrest with the assessment outcome awaiting, which has since been determined causal by VSIG and now appears on the TGA safety report. And this beautiful young lady named Natalie died after a long and traumatic ICU battle with weeks on ECMO after developing vaccine-induced myocarditis. She was in her final year of law school and just 2 weeks after her 21st birthday when she died. Today would have been Natalie's 23rd birthday. And instead, her mother and brother are spending her birthday today grieving her life lost too soon. And I also received the case report of a 14-year-old female who died and the assessment decision, unlikely causality, and a 21-year-old male who died and the assessment outcome decision was question mark causality, and a 24-year-old female who died of cardiac arrest where the assessment decision was causality, and a 9-year-old child who died of cardiac arrest and the assessment outcome decision was causality assessment outcome, and a 7-year-old boy who died of cardiac arrest and the causality outcome decision was causality. And just to be completely clear, I requested these documents under Freedom of Information because I wanted clarity on the TGA assessment of the reports of deaths. I was confused that the safety reports say 900 plus cases of death, but only 14 confirmed causal. And when I discussed this with other medical colleagues, they all draw the conclusion that all the other deaths have been reviewed and are not causal, but the language is misleading. The TGA implies this but does not explicitly state this. So I was requesting the actual TGA assessments of these reports of death. And these documents are fatal adverse event team meetings. The names are redacted, but there are multiple people present at these meetings. And the opinion of this TGA team in some of these cases, including in young children, was causal, or in other words, that the vaccine is the cause for the death. And when I asked the TGA Freedom of Information team why these documents were not published to the public disclosure log, I was advised the decision maker determined that disclosure of the documents could undermine public confidence. Yep. And reduce the willingness of the public to report adverse events to the TGA. This is outrageous. Doctors and the public have relied on the fact that out of millions of vaccines, only 14 deaths, and this appears to be completely misleading and deliberately non-transparent to the public. And before the vaccine rollout, there were also reported deaths in the elderly in Norway, and a media release by the TGA in January of 21 announced that an investigation into these deaths was underway, and then 3 weeks later that the investigation was complete and that there was no causal link between vaccination and the deaths in the elderly. And I recently obtained under Freedom of Information the correspondences related to that investigation. These report the Norway regulator stating that adverse reactions from the vaccine, such as nausea and diarrhoea, had caused a turn for the worse as the people were already so fragile and that 1 in 1,000 people had died. And John Skerritt wrote that for the 30 fatal cases, a uniform picture, nausea, vomiting, diarrhoea, leading to acute kidney injury in frail patients. And we see an email requesting some editing of the draft media release by none other than the sponsor themselves, Pfizer, which perhaps explains why doctors and the public were not advised of these risks to elderly people. This is completely unacceptable. These official communications are not advertising claims or publicity stunts. These are serious matters relating to public safety regarding reports of deaths in a vulnerable population. And inconsistencies are also seen in the review of the clinical trials for the Pfizer product. For example, these FDA review documents found multiple cases of cardiac arrest, cardiac death, and metastatic cancers in the first clinical trial for the vaccine, but that the FDA assessed these deaths as unlikely to be related to vaccination. However, no patient-level data to support this conclusion has been provided or made public. And in one example, blood clots are reported, which are attributed to diabetes and an ankle fracture, but no further information provided on these cases. One patient had pain and paresthesia that the clinical trial investigator considered was related. However, Pfizer disagreed with the investigator, stating there was not enough evidence to support a causal relationship, and thus the FDA considered the side effect unrelated to the vaccine. In another event, the trial investigator considered a heart attack in a young person to be related to the vaccine, but again, the company and the FDA disagreed with this investigator. And the TGA accepted all of these conclusions despite having no patient-level data on these events to review themselves. And a recent independent analysis of the original trial came to different conclusions, finding an excess of severe adverse events compared to placebo, which would point to the need for a formal harm-benefit analysis. And how could such different conclusions be drawn by independent biostatisticians reviewing the same trial data when the authors of the original study had concluded that the incidence of severe events was low and similar in the vaccine and placebo groups, and that safety over a median of 2 months was similar to that of other viral vaccines? And the answers to such puzzles are sometimes found in the conflict of interest disclosure documents. For example, the original Pfizer trial publication, we find that almost all of the study authors were employees and shareholders of Pfizer. And now we have the issue of long COVID. And a recent Senate inquiry has commenced into repeat COVID infections and long COVID. And anyone who's been following that inquiry or read many of the submissions will have read the harrowing stories of patients who mostly report being fully vaccinated and therefore expected mild disease or not to catch it at all, but who have been left with a range of medical conditions: severe disabling fatigue, brain fog, POTS, heart conditions, autonomic dysregulation. These patients were often young, fit and healthy and are now unable to work and are otherwise disabled by long COVID. I wrote a submission to this inquiry and drew attention to the issue of vaccine-associated enhanced disease. And this is extremely important because if vaccination actually increases the risk of a severe complication from COVID infection, then we need to be protecting the public by looking at things like air filtration and research and treatment of long COVID and other measures. We should not be recommending further vaccines if it is likely or even possible that this strategy has in fact made the COVID pandemic worse or may drive more severe disease. And this possibility of vaccine-associated enhanced disease was reviewed by experts in March of 2020, when the COVID-19 Enhanced Disease Consensus Meeting of Experts, in partnership with the Brighton Collaboration, convened to discuss the risk of vaccine-associated enhanced disease. And evidence for this phenomena was presented, including the cellular mechanisms, and caution around various types of vaccine platforms and adjuvants was discussed. And in October of 2020, a Brighton Collaboration case definition and guideline for vaccine-associated enhanced disease was published. And this expert case definition states that VAED is an illness that occurs in persons who receive a vaccine and who are subsequently infected with the pathogen that the vaccine is meant to protect against, and stated that all cases of vaccine failure should be evaluated for VAED. And in Australia, we had the unique situation of large numbers of people vaccinated who then caught COVID and therefore by definition experienced vaccine failure. And by this expert definition, each case of this should have been evaluated for VAED. And the manifestations of VAED are not just respiratory, but as this table describes, includes acute cardiac injury, bleeding or clotting events, kidney injury, abdominal pain, altered mental states, convulsional seizures, fatigue, arthritis, multi-organ failure, and death. It is basically an abnormal immune response and an exuberant immune inflammatory response following vaccination that is triggered by later contact with the virus. And the clinical outcomes described by this expert definition are death especially in a healthy person and if the death was unexpected, hospitalisation, worsening or clinical deterioration over time, a prolonged clinical course compared to natural disease, by definition, this is long COVID, complications of acute disease, or new diagnosis subsequent to infection post-vaccination. So in summary, every positive case in a vaccinated person should have been carefully evaluated for enhanced disease, and all deaths in vaccinated individuals should have been evaluated for VAED as a cause according to this expert guideline. And if we look at the excess death figures, the public health experts tell us that it's definitely not the vaccines, but it might be delayed impact of COVID. Well, I think we've demonstrated that that is a lie, but even if it was, that would also be evidence of VAED, and therefore the vaccines would still be the cause of the excess deaths in that circumstance also. So when we ask, was this healthy person or that healthy person who's just died suddenly and unexpectedly, were they vaccinated? This is not some wild conspiracy theory. This is what these expert guidelines instructed before the vaccine rollout, stating that a control group is helpful to compare the frequency of cases and the severity of illness in vaccinees versus controls, including the occurrence of specific events of concern, such as hospitalisation and mortality. But instead, from our public health officials, we were told that breakthrough infections are expected amongst people who are fully vaccinated, but this does not mean the vaccines are not working. And there has been no mention of the expert consensus summary or the Brighton collaboration definitions of VAED, so we are left to presume that the officials making these important public health decisions have not familiarised themselves with the available scientific evidence. So having lost faith in the ability of public health officials and seeing the devastating impacts on patients who had been left with disabling injuries after vaccines, who are not able to access work cover or the compensation scheme because their adverse event was not on the product information, who have been mocked and ostracised and belittled by everyone from their doctors to their workplaces to their family and friends, I took on a role as a patient advocate to assist these patients to explore their options for legal recourse. And this has culminated in a proposed class action for compensation for vaccine-injured patients and the bereaved that is to be proposed to be filed in the federal court in the coming weeks. And over 350 people have expressed an interest to join this action, and of this group of people, I've been continually amazed at their resilience, their strength, and their ability to care for each other. These patients have a range of injuries, horrific injuries, from paralysis to seizure disorders, deafness, blindness, strokes, myocarditis, stillbirths, cardiac arrests, blood clots, aggressive cancers. I have seen members of this group support each other with ideas for referrals and treatment protocols, to help each other crowdfund for MRIs, and to ask for nothing more than to be heard and acknowledged and treated with dignity, not to be mocked or ignored. And the proposed action is being funded entirely by donations and will be representing everyone in Australia with a vaccine injury, and God willing will bring justice and compensation for all the injured. And among the group is Raylene, a remarkable, strong woman representing Caitlin, her beautiful, vibrant and healthy daughter. Caitlin became unwell immediately after her second mRNA vaccine and then died suddenly and unexpectedly just weeks later. And yesterday should have been Caitlin's 25th birthday. Instead, her mother and her brothers spent yesterday grieving the loss of her life taken too soon. These people are not just excess death numbers or TGA case report statistics. This is someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's son. And I have seen Raylene extend the arm of comfort, friendship, and a listening ear to the bereaved around the world who have reached out to her after hearing her story and who just needed to talk to another person who would understand what it is like to lose a child, and particularly to lose a healthy child following vaccination, when almost everyone would turn their back and say it was coincidence, or if it was caused by the vaccine at all, that the loss of their child was somehow for the greater good. And so it is my greatest hope that in 2023, doctors will turn back to our code of conduct, remembering that we each have a responsibility to behave ethically, to justify the trust the community has or perhaps had in the medical profession, that the care of our patients is our primary concern, and good care involves taking into account the patient views and respecting and recognising the patient's rights to make their own healthcare decisions. And to take steps to alleviate patient symptoms and distress, whether or not a cure is possible. As doctors, we are not only allowed, but required to ask patients when they had a vaccine and if it might have caused their symptoms, and to discuss this with our colleagues and to work together to find treatments for our patients who are suffering, and to demand that our government and political leaders provide financial support for these patients to access the care they need. Thank you.